And welcome to part 3 of Sun Tzu's Art of Warhammer, series where I look at how Sun Tzu, the great Chinese general, tactics and quotes can apply to, well, tabletop gaming. In particular, as I get back into a Warhammer fantasy in the form of Age of Sigmar, I can't help but reminded of some of the quotes that helped me become a better Warhammer fantasy battle gamer and that I now intend to apply to Age of Sigmar. So in the first 2 parts, we had a look at army building and deployment. And in this third part, we're going to have a little look at initial engagement. So the first quote, absolute classic, is attack what is weak and avoid what is strong. Now, the way I apply this to fantasy tabletop gaming is to go through a process. You need to identify, and you've got time to do this. First of all, your opponent shows you their army. We're going to show you their roster, what's in it. You've got the deployment time itself. Get a little bit of time. You need to go through a process, identifying that army, what is strong. Now, what is strong for one person is not the same as for another. In other words, what you're looking at is you're thinking, what scares the bejesus out of my army? Then you need to think to yourself, can I eliminate it with a low-risk strategy? I don't mean something where you've got to rely on getting a load of 6s and your opponent gets a load of 1s for their save rolls. Can you apply a low-risk strategy that will eliminate this threat or these threats? If the answer is yes, then you need to decide how you're going to do that. Great, you've got a tactic for it. Your general strategy is to eliminate that threat. The tactic is how you're going to do that. If the answer is no, then can you avoid it? Avoiding it in Warhammer Fantasy is the same as saying, can you contain it? If the answer is no, and it's not always easy to do so, then you have to go back and ask yourself, okay, how can I eliminate the threat, even if it has to be a slightly higher risk? Because if the threat is so great that left alone, it's just going to go rampaging through your army, you cannot simply allow it to do that. You have to chance your hand a little bit if necessary. But if you can contain it, then that's what you want to do so. And you might be able to contain it by, for example, using scenery to block line of sight, getting it to only be able to attack you where you are strongest, being able to use large units to hold it up, those sorts of things. Classic story from Warhammer Fantasy Battle days. I was in a grand tournament and I was having the time of my life. On the first day, I'd scored 3 massacres, maximum points. The start of the second day, I was on the top table and I had a very elite, very maneuverable Chaos Warrior army. And I was up against a Skaven army. Now, Skaven generally are my favourite army. So I knew all about them. I knew lots, pretty much most things about all the armies. But Skaven, I was intimately aware of. And I can only put this down to tiredness because I made the most heinous error. It wasn't necessarily the worst mistake I've ever made. It was certainly the one with the greatest consequences. My army's general strategy, I had a Chaos Lord and a Chaos Dragon. I had a unit of Chosen Knights. The general strategy was outflank, pincer movement, attack weak units, disrupt other units with the rest of my army, and eventually close around the stronger units when I've got basically my whole army and their chaff has been removed, and surround them. And, when it worked beautifully. So what I did is I looked at this army and I said, right, so what are the great strengths? Generally speaking, the layout of the army should have been perfect for me. It's an infantry army, but it's an infantry army that can't sit back. So it has to move forward so I can easily get around its flanks. But it had a Grey Seer on a Screaming Bell. Now, in Fantasy Battle days, a level 4 wizard basically had 4 spells, but you didn't choose them like you do in Age of Sigmar. You rolled them from your spell list. There were 6 spells on it, as much as there are now. So basically he was going to get a random 4 spells. Now, there were a couple of spells that actually, against a very elite army like mine, would be devastating. Basically, any spell that is going to ignore armor saves is going to be pretty devastating. Just like these days in Age of Sigmar, I suppose the same thing still applies. But mostly, what we'd now be worried about in an elite unit is mortal wounds. So I thought, I've got to take out that Grey Seer. So while the deployment was still going ahead, I was thinking, what am I going to do? And I worked it out and I said, do you know what? My Chaos Lord can just go straight at him. I'll maul it to pieces. Job done. And then from there, I've got the easy job of just mopping the rest of it up. It was a very low risk strategy. So I said, that's how I'm going to deal with it. Now, before I go on to why that was an error, because at the time that was fine, I have to. He was actually quite lucky. He had an item that gave it regeneration, and he basically regenerated all his wounds, all his wounds. So I basically couldn't wound it. It was the most spectacular piece of luck you've ever seen. But I don't blame bad luck in this particular case, because where I went wrong is when he rolled for his spells, which is pretty much the last thing he did before you start the game. He didn't roll any of the 2 spells that would be dangerous to me. So actually he was very unlucky. It wasn't me that was unlucky. He was unlucky. Because what I should have done at that time was to have reassessed the threat. Something happened which knocked it down. All of a sudden that Grey Seer was no longer a threat to me, because the other spells he had were a bit of a waste of time against my army. They weren't going to do very much against my army. You know, they were more useful against armies with huge units. You know, the sorts of ones where roll for every model in the unit, on a 6 something horrible happens to them. And you've got small units, you're not likely to, you know, you can get lucky, but you're not likely to get anything. So I should have gone, right, back to plan A, which is pincer movement with everything, smash. I'd have easy won. There was nothing he could do about it. That game was on a platter for me. But I didn't. I stuck to it. I had it in my head. This is what I'm going to do. I'd worked out my strategy. I didn't change it because of a change in situation. Straight into him. Yes, I still should have torn him to pieces. Yes, he got lucky with his regeneration rolls. But I should never have put myself in the position where he could get lucky and I do badly out of it. So that's why it's really important to not only be able to identify the threats and go through that process, but if anything happens, obviously you don't roll for spells these days, but if anything else happens that reduces or changes your threat assessment, that you change your general strategy as well. Next quote, he says, appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend, march swiftly to places where you are not expected. Now the first point is so easy with Age of Sigmar because you have objective points. So appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend, especially in a game or a battle plan where you get points for each turn. If you suddenly outnumber and therefore you've captured that point, they've got to do something about it. They can wait a turn or two, they don't have to rush. But basically get yourself attacking points which are weak, but that they have got to reinforce. The reason that they're not already strong, those points, you've got to bear in mind, a weak point that you attack is only weak because your opponent didn't expect you to attack that point. So by doing so, you're doing something they haven't expected. And therefore, they've got to change their general strategy. And when you have to change your general strategy quickly, you are more likely to make a mistake because it's not thoroughly considered. They haven't weighed up pros and cons. They're reacting. Get your opponent to react as much as possible. March swiftly to places where you are not expected. So what I talked about in the deployment is trying to put fast units in a position where they've got at least 2 sensible lines of attack. You can try and trick your opponent into thinking you're going to take 1 line of attack. Maybe when you're placing the models, you're lining it up with something, just trying to work out distances. In fact, in Age of Sigmar, you don't even have to work it out. You're allowed to get the old tape measure out whenever you like, aren't you? So, and get your opponent thinking you're going to take 1 line of attack, but in reality, you've got another one, and that's the one you potentially take. Or indeed, just give yourself options. 2 lines of attack, then depending on how your opponent reacts, you can change or carry on with what you intended in the first place. Now, you also need to... I mean, Age of Sigmar, it's always said that it's a very streamlined game. I don't think it is at all. I think it's very far from a streamlined version of Fantasy Battle. I think it's got lots of little rules in there. And I was thinking also about common errors that I've seen when I've been watching battle reports. And the biggest common error I have seen, and this is it seems to particularly happen in the first turn, that initial engagement, is people forgetting about one of these fiddly rules their army has. You know, it might be forgetting about a particular command trait ability that they can use every turn in the hero phase, or an ability that has to be used at the start of the hero phase. And you watch these battle reports, and what they usually do is just take it out of turn. But of course, in a tournament, and I don't really know what the etiquette is for that, but that's a bit, you know, I would be thinking, you shouldn't really be doing that. I don't think I would refuse, unless, of course, something's happened whereby if they take it now, I would change what I would have decided, or some decision I would have made. But it's still, you know, you should remember these things. So one thing I've suggested, and I don't know why people don't do this, or why the people I watch in battle reports don't do this, just create yourself a little crib sheet of the things that are easily forgotten. Not a huge long list of all the rules in your army, because then everything will get lost. You won't be able to see the wood for the trees. but just the few things that are easily forgotten. Like, not the rules for a unit, because when you're engaging with a unit, well, quite frankly, you should be looking at the war scroll for it. So you shouldn't forget those. Little things like, for example, my Knight's Haunt army that I'm building at the moment has a rule where if an enemy takes a battle shock test and fails it, then a hero within, I think it's something like 6 inches, can regain a wound. Just write that down. Have yourself a crib sheet where you've got the general flow of the game with battle shock test, just having bold at the top. If an enemy unit fails, then a hero within whatever it is, 6 inches, I believe it is, can regain a wound. Just a few little things in bold, just there to leap out at you so you do not forget. In particular, the things you do at the start of the hero phase. That's ultra important there. Another thing I've seen, sometimes I watch a battle report and basically someone loses in 2 turns. Now, if someone has lost in 2 turns, either they've built their army poorly, or they've used it poorly. Because even though there's a certain element of paper, rock, scissors, which I'm going to come to later on in this episode as well, you shouldn't be losing that quickly. It means something has gone badly wrong if you are losing that quickly. So next little quote from Sun Tzu there. It says, if your enemy is secure at all points, be prepared for him. So what this can relate to in Age of Sigmar, so let's say you've got the paper, rock, scissors element. You've got a particular army, and the army that's ranged against you, basically you look at it and you think, do you know what? It's like they've made that army specifically to take me out. It can happen. In particular, while I've been building my Nighthaunt army, I've been getting other battle tomes so that I can learn what strengths and weaknesses other armies have in general so that I can prepare for those. I was having a little read of the Stormcast Eternals battle tome. Not only has it got this huge range of units, I keep reading all these rules and thinking, because I know straight away my Nighthaunt army, I know a couple of key weaknesses. One, well, weaknesses by virtue of the fact anything that bypasses a strength is a weakness in my army, sort of. It's a bit convoluted. But for example, one great strength of my army is virtually every unit, bar one, has a 4+ save, but it's unmodifiable. And all Nighthaunt units get an unmodifiable save. So, like, when someone says, they usually say, right, I need a 3 to hit. Okay, now I need a 4 to win. And then they might say something like -2 rend. They might as well not say that to me because I don't care. Rend does nothing to me. So anything that bypasses that, such as mortal wounds, is going to particularly be bad for my army because I'm effectively paying the points for this unmodifiable save in my units, and it's bypassing it. Stormcast Eternals, so many things that can just do mortal wounds, straight up mortal wounds. There are also lots of rules that give them extra bonus, that are nasty enough, and then give extra bonuses. Sometimes it's just against Chaos units, sometimes it's against Chaos or Death units, sometimes it's specifically against Nighthaunt units. So you might come up against something like that. And let's say you look at it and you just think to yourself, when you're going through what are the strengths of that army, I just think, it's strong all the way through. I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. You don't know how you're going to deal with it. You can't think of any realistic way, even with slightly high risk, because there's no point in going for their best unit. Okay, well, if I charge this unit into it, and if I roll all 6s, then I've got a chance. That's not a tactic to pursue. So there's no realistic prospect of you doing anything, or you can't think of anything. What you have to do at the very least is still prepare for it. You can't just go, well, let's just do whatever. If that means thinking to yourself, well, okay, objective-wise, I've just got to keep my army together so that because this thing can race it, my only chance is keeping the army together, then that's what you will have to do. If your only chance is potentially using scenery to block line of sights to an awful lot of things, then again, that's what you're going to have to do, even if it means sacrificing some early points with objectives or positions with objectives early on. You've got to, with your initial engagement, protect your army. You cannot allow, whether you're taking the first turn or whether you're allowing your opponent to take the first turn or they get the choice and take the first turn or whatever happens, you cannot put yourself into a position where you're going to walk into an obvious trap or to play in the way that just plays towards you what you know they're going to do. Because one big advantage of an opponent that just looks like they've got an army that's just got you nailed down, it's like you are their target practice. One big advantage of that is you almost always know exactly what your opponent's going to do, because they don't have to be sneaky. They do not have to be sneaky. You know what they're going to do. So at this point, you need to do something that they are not expecting, or at least confounds what they want to do, even if it's just a delaying tactic, because you never know what can then happen. You might, for example, if it's a lot of very powerful shooting, make sure you outrange it. The example I talked about last week in deployment, where someone placed a Neferata model, 400-point model, in the most advanced position they could against Caradron Overlords, who then proceeded to blow the crap out of her, destroyed it completely, before that player even got to move that model, let alone do any magic with it or anything. It was weak against a lot of shooting. Should have outranged it from the start. And that's what you need to do here. If you feel that shooting attacks are going to be a problem, outrange it, have line of sight problems with it. If you feel that someone confounding all your magic, because that's another thing Stormcast Eternals do, they've got units that can really get the upper hand in unbinding, you need to make sure you outrange them. That's not so easy, but you know, you might need to. Especially if in your first turns all you really want to do is get a Mystic Shield off. Just make sure you've outranged it. But of course that would be an issue for deployment, really. The next little quote, it says, pretend to be weak that he may grow arrogant. Now this is an interesting one. What this can sometimes take the form of. These days it should be very difficult to really disguise weakness within your army, because even though many opponents you may have may not know the particulars of your army, you are showing them the roster. They do get to read the rules on it. And I would always assume that my opponent knows as much as I do about my own army. Always go with that assumption. Unless, of course, they do or say something that calls it into question, then potentially you can play on that. But don't try and fall into a trap of thinking that they just don't know the little foibles of your army. But what you can still do is potentially leave what looks to be a little bit of a trap, a little bit of a weaker area that you know you can instantly reinforce in the hopes of trapping them. The classic military tactic is to have a slightly weak centre so that your opponent rushes into it and then your flanks surround them and you gobble them all up. You can have a similar sort of situation here as well. Next quote, it says, if his forces are united, separate them. This is crucial. Just as I said, you don't really want to be separating your own forces, and that's a theme that will come back again. You do want to separate your opponent's forces. Particularly if there's a strong point, but you think to yourself, but if I can absolutely mug it, then I'm in for a chance. What you really want to do is to try and draw it out. This works particularly well if you're up against a flank or something like that of your opponent's army, where the particular model you wish to draw out is much faster than the rest. Because it's likely to be able to get a charge in, and it may want to get a charge in on its own with the others labouring behind, by which time on your turn, hopefully if you get the next turn, obviously double turns can be a thing in Age of Sigmar, you can move around it and you can take it on with 3, potentially even 4 units, and you might well be able to defeat it like that without too many losses yourself. I mean, this is the use of a classic pincer movement. In general terms, your opponent's laid out. If you get the initial engagement, you want to try and outflank them. What this forces your opponents to do, generally speaking, a lot of players will make themselves, I'm not saying all by any means, but a lot of players tend to focus on the centre. And the centre may not be the centre of the battlefield, but the centre of their army, where it happens to be. It may be offset depending on where the objectives are or where the scenery is. But most players tend to focus on the centre, and the centre tends to be stronger. And then the flanks can often even have weak units on them. Maybe they're, artillery units. They put them on the flank to get the best field of view, maybe. So by moving around to the outside edge of these things, you can effectively separate units in the centre, which might have been intended to work in concert with one another, because they have to reinforce not just one flank, but both, if you can threaten both, and therefore split their forces up. And especially if you've got an army that's more manoeuvrable than them, you may then not even have to fight on 2 fronts yourself. You may then be able to quickly move one of the forces that was threatening one flank quickly towards the other, and you might be able to then outnumber it. Next one. This can sometimes be at odds with the notion of trying to do something a little bit expected. There are a few quotes where it's almost contradictory, but I think what you're supposed to do is choose whichever one is most suitable for the situation. So what he says is, engage people with what they expect. It is what they are able to discern and confirms their projections. It settles them into predictable patterns of response, occupying their minds while you wait for the extraordinary moment, that which they cannot anticipate. So this is, again, on the initial move, on your first turn. If you move your models and act in such a way that they expected, it seems perfectly in keeping with the way you deployed and the way you were lining up, then they then become comfortable that they understand how the battle is going to go. If you are then able on the next turn to do something radically different to what you appeared to be doing, you can catch them out. And this is where it's much better, because it's impossible to conceal. Like in a real army, you might be able to conceal some units. You can't really do that in Age of Sigmar. The best you can do when it comes to that is having units in reserve that then pop up later, and Nighthaunters and a number of, well, Stormcast Eternals is another classic case, isn't it? But there are a number of armies that have at least some units that can do that. That's the nearest you can get with it, but generally speaking, what you want to do is give yourself options. Give yourself options for the way they can move. And if you're able to do that, particularly with a fast unit, then you can move one way and then quickly move another. Because let's say you want to charge headlong at a particular unit. You identify, I need to charge this really quickly. I've got these fast units to do so. If you know it's going to take 2 turns to realistically charge it anyway, and you know that in 2 turns you will easily make the distance unless you roll a load of rubbish on your run and then charge rolls, you don't have to take a direct line to it. You just simply need to know that on the balance of probability, you will get to it in your second turn. So what you can do is look like you're going one particular way, not veering miles away from your general line, but looking like you're aiming to charge another part of the army. And then, well, because it's largely a skirmish game anyway, pivoting. Okay, faster units tend to be cavalry, longer bases. It takes up more of your movement to pivot it, of course, because the back end goes further. But if you're working all this out, you can still create a situation where you can look like you're going one way and then quickly charge the other way. Maybe your opponent has reinforced where it looked like you were going, and they've now exposed where you wanted to go that looked a little bit strong at the time. And then they've got to then spend time reinforcing that, and they've basically wasted 2 of their turns potentially. During the battle itself, these sort of things do take more inspiration, which is where when he says at the end of that quote, that which they cannot, occupy their minds while you wait for the extraordinary moment, that which they cannot anticipate. That's sort of something for the battle itself rather than initial engagement. I always say army building is something you can do with months of time. You can be planning an army for a tournament in months of time to go. Deployment, you also have a fairly good time of it, because you can usually see your opponent's army for 5 or 10 minutes before you even need to start deploying, depending on how the tournament's organised. And then the deployment itself, obviously you can't take forever over it, but all you're focusing on is getting them deployed properly. You've got time to do it. You've got time to come up with, and also you've got time before the tournament to come up with realistic scenarios. And if your opponent is following one of the scenarios you anticipated, then the deployment, again, you've thought about it in much more time. The initial engagement, because the initial engagement should follow a general strategy you'd already worked out in advance, then again, you do need to react to what your opponent does, because remember what I said about the Skaven, where I failed to react to a changing situation. But as long as you do that, again, initial engagement should already be planned out in advance. But after the first turn, at that point, that's where reactivity and being able to be inspired to think of something innovative on the fly is much more important. Of course, that's not something that's easily taught. That's just experience and application. Next little quote from him. It says, be extremely subtle even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate. So that might seem to go a little at odds with the behave as expected so that you lull them into a false sense of security. But again, it depends on the scenario. The way I tend to think of this scenario as being useful is when you have no plan yourself. You don't have a strategy. I remember when I was at school and I was in the 6th form, and we used to play chess with a few friends of mine. And we weren't grandmasters, of course, but we used to play chess. And we played this one kid. None of us really knew very well, but he was interested in chess and played chess. And I was playing this game with him. I never played against him before. And it seemed to me, I was easily thrashing him. To anyone else, it looked like I was absolutely caning him. He didn't know what he was doing. And then somehow he beat me. And no one else had any notion of what just happened either. And what I thought it was at the time was he just made the most ridiculous moves. I couldn't work it out. That I think what I did is stop taking him seriously and therefore stopped taking my own strategy seriously. And sometimes the same thing can apply in lots of different games. If you are acting your initial deployment in a way that seems a little haphazard, doesn't seem to fit with what they're expecting, it can throw your opponent a little bit because they don't really know what's going on. So it might have one or two effects. One, they might do the same thing. They might think, well, this person has no form. They don't know what they're doing. And they can be a bit more relaxed and they might then make errors. Or it can have the opposite effect. It can call them to question themselves thinking, what are they up to? Because I cannot see what they're up to here. So if all else fails, sometimes I will say, just do not totally mad things. Don't stick out a unit that's going to get its head shot off out on its own with no supports. Don't be silly. But do things that don't necessarily look like they're sensible, or at least don't seem to be following the expected plan. Sometimes that can include just doing random things, just to confuse your opponent. Next quote, penultimate quote. It says, move swift as the wind and closely formed as the wood. Attack like the fire and be still as the mountain. So the first one is super important. And this is where it can get tricky, I think, in Age of Sigmar with charges. So it's very easy to predict your movement phase because you may or may not run. And of course, there's a little bit of randomness to that. But you've got your normal movement. If you intend to charge, let's say that turn, you've got your normal movement. That's very predictable. You know exactly what it is. You don't even have to judge it in Age of Sigmar. You're allowed to get the tape measure out. But then when it comes to the charge, so let's say you've got 3 units and you want to charge in concert against a strong point of the opponent army. You have to attack this strong point. You've just been forced into it. And you don't need all 3 of those units to get the charge on. But let's say out of the 3 units, one of them, if that's the only one that makes the charge, you're going to be in trouble. So you have to therefore consider the order in which you do your charges. Because let's say you've got unit A, B and C. Unit A is going to be an important support unit, but if it's the only one that makes the charge in the close combat phase, it's going to get its face smashed in. Whereas unit B and C, if either one of those was the only one that got in, then they'd still be able to put up a fight. You obviously don't want to do the charge with A first, because let's say they make it, but neither B nor C do, well, they are in that position. They're stuck on their own. So it can be a case of where units have to work in concert, you do need to keep them closely formed. But there are those randomness. There's the randomness of the run roll, but then there's the very much larger randomness of the charge roll. And you have to expect that there will be times where some units, of course, will be able to make the charge. And the further away you are when you're doing these rolls, the more likely it is to be. And work out the scenarios. What are the scenarios? The scenarios are this unit alone makes it, this unit alone makes it, this unit alone makes it, these 2 make it and this one doesn't, and so on. And maybe if you're lucky, all 3 make it. Think about that. Sometimes you need to think to yourself, is it just better for us all to get close enough? And because sometimes it'll be better for your opponent to charge you than to not get all 3 in, especially if you're talking about units that don't even get a charge bonus against units that don't get a charge bonus as well. Sometimes it might be a no-brainer just to move within the 3 and a nanometer inches away. In terms of attack like the fire and be still as the mountain, of course, what that means is when you do attack, you need to make sure you can have enough overwhelming fire to do that. The same thing applies here. It's just working out the stats. Are you preferably overwhelmingly likely to be able to inflict massive losses to the point where they're at least going to fail a battle shock or likely to fail a battle shock? But still as the mountain just basically means, but can you also stand, especially if you're, if you don't make those damages, you get unlucky with your rolls or whatever, Are you able to stand your ground, especially if your opponent might get a double turn? So that's always very important as well. Are you able to stand? Do you have the capacity to do that? Whether that capacity is in terms of numbers for the units, or numbers of units, whether it's in the capacity for any healing, if depending on what army you play, you may have access to some healing, or being able to reinforce them as necessary as well. So you need to consider these eventualities too. And then the final one, most important, and again something that you can only set really in that initial engagement. It's very difficult to be able to employ this later on in the battle. It says, thus the expert in battle moves the enemy and is not moved by him. And this is ultimately it. The eventual winner of any strategy game is not the one who gets lucky. If anything comes down to the roll of a few dice, that's a nonsense, because there will have been several engagements throughout the battle. And it'll all even itself out. I know it's tempting to think in the last turn of the game, a particular engagement, if one person gets the dice they need, then that puts them in a commanding position. If they don't, it puts the others. But everything that led up to it led to that. You should never, if ever you've put yourself in a position where the roll of a few dice determines the outcome, then you've not done it correctly. Similarly, your opponent hasn't done it correctly either. But it's not the one who gets lucky or unlucky. It's the one who dictates the pace and the direction of the game. And that's something that gets set right from the start. Because after the initial engagement, turns after that tend to be reactive. Whoever got the best out of the first battle phase is likely, or battle turn rather I should say, is likely to be the one that's going to get the best out of the next one. If it tended to be a bit of a draw, then it's going to be whoever grasps the opportunities that are going to come both of those players' way. But ultimately, if you can direct the pace and the direction of the battle, then your opponent is having to react to what you are doing. And it really doesn't matter whether you're going first or second. What the aim is to get your opponent to react to what you are doing, not the other way around. Because if you are constantly having to react to what your opponent's doing, it's preventing you from following a strategy. Because you're not following your strategy, you're following your opponent's strategy. And as I say, the longer it goes on, the more difficult it is to wrest control back and to dictate the pace yourself. So it's very, very important that it is something that you do early on. And then if your army has been designed well, and your deployment is done well, and your initial turn is played out correctly, at that point, you can often be very confident of success or failure, or it could still be a tight game if your opponent plays just as well. But you sometimes, even after the first turn, can get a real feeling that I've got this under control. All I have to do now is maintain control. So anyway, I hope that gives you a little bit of food for thought. If you're enjoying the series, then don't forget to click like, comment, subscribe for further content. And also share with others who might also be interested. Next week, we'll be looking at some more of Sun Tzu's quotes with regards to the chaos of the battle itself. Or hopefully we'll be able to distill some order from that chaos. But thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.